Well, welcome everyone, and well, let me start off with wishing you all a very happy New Year. Let's see what this year brings us. It's been a hectic year last year, and I'm sure there's again lots to come this year. So this call, well, it's the first call of the year. So traditionally, we'll look back at 22. So Adam has the latest numbers, really fresh. Until the 31st of December. So really anxious to hear from him. But before we do that, I'll hand over to Frank.
Thank you, Peter. And, obviously welcome and Happy New Year to everybody. We're anxious to get started on another year. So we think these meetings are really important, and obviously the partnership between GTDC and context is critical, and the data and the information that's provided is very useful. We have continued with our research efforts in developing a variety of different content that's available on our website. The latest report is distribution as a recession countermeasure. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about what 2023 will hold relative to recession. Will there be one? If there is one, how bad it will be, et cetera. We think there's a number of things that the IT community can take advantage of, working with distribution to help maybe, if there is going to be an impact, maybe keep the impact as minimal as possible. So there's a number of things in here for folks to be thinking about. I'd encourage all of you to download this report. It's relatively new. I think it's been out for 2 or 3 weeks. The other item, just a reminder, we've got our 2 big summits coming up. The one in February in North America is about 4 weeks away. Really looking forward to that. We've got tracking really good attendance right now. It's going to be an interesting and informative agenda. And then, of course, we're planning our middle of the year June event for Amsterdam, and there'll be opportunities to register for that coming out relatively quickly. So with that, I'm anxious to see the numbers too. So Adam, I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be invited again and see everybody for this new year. So let's see what it brings, but we're going to start off with a review of the year. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is to join us on the Slido, which is, if you have a QR reader, you can just read the QR code, or if you go on to slido.com on your phone, then put in the hashtag 3020108. And then I will ask a couple of questions at the beginning, and I want to ask a few at the end. Last year, I asked some questions in the January 2022 session, and I did actually in the other sessions we did, and it proves a really useful reference point for us during the year to hear what you said at the beginning of the year. So it'd be quite interesting. And I've added a few new ones just to get a sense, hopefully helpful to you as well, as to what you see going on in the market. So let's move on from that, and we look at our spidery graph that shows the evolution of the channel. And you can see that in Q4, we did that big mountainous climb again, and that there was, in fact, small percentage growth in Q4. And we're going to look at that in some depth now as to what actually happened in Q4. So we finished below forecast, as has already been pointed out to me by Patrick. We forecast 6% with telecoms, 5.8 without. We actually came in at 1.1%. It looked like we were doing really well in October and November. We were tracking pretty good, 4.9, 3.8%. And then December hit us. And December was really disappointing in terms of particularly the volume business. Mobile computing was the main culprit, but then also you can see it's not just that, it's monitors, it's headsets, it's everything. And December 2021 I was looking back at my notes. In fact, I'd forgotten. It was a giant month. It was a mammoth month. In fact, I think it was the largest month we ever had on record. So October and November were not so good. December was a really tough comparative. But nevertheless, with that, the results came down to around about, as I say, just over 1% growth. It's always nice to put this in perspective, which we do now. You can see as I move on here to look at what it actually looks like compared to the last 2 years. So in fact, Q4 was a negative compared to Q4 2020. Q4 2020 was like almost, I think with Q1 21, it was the height of the pandemic explosion of product being sold. So when we see 1.1% growth in Q4 22, we mustn't forget that that's on the back of huge growth in 2020. And only a really small loss in 2021. So there we are. Now, when we look at the full year, we have a really interesting, it's the first time we've shown this, and it's, we come in very, very close to the forecast which we put together at the beginning of the year. In terms of our forecasting, we were much closer in H1 than in H2. In Q3, we under forecast, and in Q4, we over forecast. But overall, when you look at it, we came in within 0.7% of the without telecoms number. And the reason we did this separated out the two is because telecoms was going through a channel shift with Apple going through directly to retailers. So we didn't want to bias the results of the market by that type of distortion. So we were pretty negative about the impact of that Apple change. And in fact, the telecoms didn't have such a big impact on the actuals. You can see that in fact, with telecoms, it was 0.1% higher than with telecoms. But nevertheless, we can see that we were pretty close to the annual forecast, which we made last January. And this is just for perspective. We go back to 2015, and it gives us an idea of how we're situated. I think that for all of us, as we sit here, we're still kind of remembering that we've been through a real shift that took place in 2020. I've had 5 forecasting sessions this week talking about various sectors. I think most people feel that 2023 is still going to be an unusual year. We're not into a normal rhythm. There's still supply chain issues, overstocking of certain products, supply chain shortages of others, good positive backlog impact on some areas, and inventory issues in others. So I think 2023 still seems like it's not a steady state year. But nevertheless, when you look at it, you can see that since 2020, there has been consistent growth in the channel building on the pandemic. And that is also aided by the price rises which have taken place. So not always, and I'm going to show you the Q4 numbers, not always in terms of units shipped, but certainly in terms of total sales and value, a consistent increase in distribution in Europe since 2020 at high levels. And this is just to remind you that a year ago, when I asked you, you said between 3 to 4%. So I think that we were all on the same page. And I think if we hadn't had this very poor December and close to the year, we would have actually been within that 3 to 4% forecast which people had made. So let's have a look and see what happened in Q4. You can see here that volume fell in Q4 quite significantly. Value did as well, because value had a superb Q3, but you'll see that in various areas it went down a bit. But it was really volume going down to minus 7.1%, which really impacted things. And I'll take you through a little bit more detail on what actually constitutes that decrease. This is a slide which shows the relative performance in both units, ASP, and revenues. So what you can see is that there's been a 16% decline in units sold, which compares to 11% in Q3. and then compensated for by increase in ASP, which is slightly less than in Q3. When you look at these numbers, you see some big drops here. The one which is most significant from the volume perspective is, of course, notebooks, which is such a high value item going through distribution, minus 23% in terms of units. This is a very significant drop. We were looking in previous quarters at around about between 10 and 15% drop. So this is by far the biggest one. We're still in the process of working out what actually happened. We think that it's a mixture of decline in demand and also potentially resellers having too much stock, or maybe being prepared to live with more stock. But you know, that was the big shock, and I don't think anyone was expecting such a big reduction. But you can see other big reductions there. You can see ink cartridges down 19%. You can see processors down 22%, and then graphic cards, which had been growing considerably before, at least in value terms, down as well. When we look then at the ASPs, you can see some nice juicy increases there. Look, for example, at the network switches, 53% growth in ASP. This is quarter on quarter, but you can see consistently there are big increases in ASP, which has definitely saved the day in terms of the overall numbers in distribution. And that translates into a revenue pattern, which is pretty mixed, actually. You've got growth in some areas, particularly the value ones. You can see big growth there in servers, which grew 35%. You can see huge growth there in wireless access points. Two of the big highlights of this quarter, the switches up 20%. So I hope that's helpful to give an idea about what it is that underpins this actual 1.1% growth. This is the focus on the hardware. If we look at the executive summary, which is a new format that we introduced last quarter, which really focuses us on the essentials of what is going on in the channel. And we have it in 5 different categories: infrastructure, which is servers, storage, networking, computing components, personal systems, which is mobile computing, desktops, peripherals, printers, monitors, software and services, and then telecoms. So what you can see there is this huge drop in the personal systems, minus 9%, which is the big drop. The infrastructure, as I say, mainly driven on a country basis, the infrastructure. The particular country which had a really poor performance in infrastructure in Q4 was in fact Germany. And Germany is big. So when Germany doesn't perform, it brings down everybody else. And I'll show you the German numbers in a minute, but that's very significant in terms of the infrastructure. Personal systems pretty much across the board. Peripherals is a bit of a mixed bag because you've got a huge increase in the sales of printers where the supply chain eased up. And then you've got a big reduction in terms of monitors where the kind of the feasting period was over, and there was quite a big reduction both in terms of units but also in terms of value, and so that was disappointing. Software has been an absolute star performer throughout this year and last year. The overall performance is brought down by services, which is only at 1%, but software itself, 14% growth, which is terrific and is definitely the leading category in the channel. I do have a breakdown here, which I won't go through in huge detail. You'll get this in your pack, but this shows the breakdown into what we call key sectors, which is how we used to do our forecasting presentations, but we felt it was just too many details. But you can see there, for example, the printing 28% up. You can see the infrastructure down 9%, and then that you add to that the components as well. So that is an executive summary of what has gone on by category. Again, we go back to what you forecast last year, your actual versus growth prediction. So up until Q3 looked like the same picture. You pretty much got it right. The only one was that displays was doing a lot better than any of you forecast or thought it was going to do in 2022. And that was very much driven, I have to say, by the LFD, which was growing at a huge rate until Q4. When we get into Q4, you could almost give that a tick because you can see that the annual growth of displays is now down to 7% after Q4. So I gave that a tick and a cross. So at this point here, I'm going to ask you a question. Which industry sector will grow the fastest in 2023? I've changed it slightly from last year. I thought it was more interesting. I've picked sectors which I think have more growth potential. But we're talking about percentage growth. We're not talking about actual value. We're talking about percentage growth. So that's why, I mean, when you look at something like printing, which grew by 28% in Q4, if it carries on its performance in 2023, it could be that it surprises us all, a very kind of tried and tested category. And then we've got the networking areas have been growing so fast. I mean, as have servers 38 or 35% in Q4. Disk storage, probably unlikely. So I think that we can conclude that you're very much in favor of software. I'm not at all surprised by that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question then. And this is just which channel will grow the fastest in 2023? It's a bit unfair asking you this now because I'm not showing you which channel grew the fastest in 2022. But let's see which one you think will be the fastest channel to grow in 2023. Corporate resellers may be a lot more robust as we go into a difficult economic period. SMR may be under challenge. Well, let's see. It's certainly not the case in 2022, as I'm going to show you when we go on to the actual results. So let's have a look at the Q4 forecast versus actual by country. So this was the country forecast, and we actually did pretty well on the 5 major countries, except for Germany. Germany was the one that we got wrong. And you can see there that it came in at minus 2.9% and we'd forecast 3.7. The others are pretty close if you look at UK, Italy, France, and Spain. And certainly directionally, we got, you know, all of those 5 countries right. Where we got it wrong as well was that there's a bunch of what we call the major countries, which had been growing a lot faster than the big 5. And Q4 was the time in which they really slowed down their growth rates. So you can see that we forecast 14.8% from Poland, it came in at 1.4. The Nordics came in just marginally growing, rest of Europe, which is all the other countries. So you can, that gives you an idea of the country by country split. And we have this, which again is more of a takeaway for you to have a look at afterwards. But I just wanted to highlight Germany, where you can see that infrastructure is minus 1%. If you look at the other countries, here, you've got 10% growth in the UK, 13% growth in Italy, 13% in France, and 13% in Spain. So Germany is an outlier. Software -3, 5 in the UK, 23 in Italy, 13 in France, and 6 in Spain. Again, it's an outlier. And that value business has just not been performing in Germany. So we've spoken about lack of confidence in Germany. We saw a huge increase in confidence in Q3. Q3, if you look at it, was 5.9% growth, when I spoke to the German channel leading into this forecast, people were optimistic, but it just looks as though the delivery has not come through. So I think that it goes down a lot to business confidence in Germany, which is the underlying reason why we're seeing that value business declining. When you look at the major country slowdown, you can see here that look at Poland, just as an example, 17.4% growth in Q3, down to 1.4%. Again, not a strong one in infrastructure. You know, it had been growing at 4% in infrastructure, minus 7%. So not a good performance. That should change in 2023. I'm really hopeful that Poland will get the boost of the EU funds when they finally agree with the EU about how they're going to do things. So let's move on to the channel split. Okay, so SMR closed the year very strongly. It was the only channel that grew in Q4, 6.6%. All the other channels went down. Corporate reseller had some tough comparatives because of big education deals going through in Q4 2021. But nevertheless, and had done a lot better earlier on in the year, corporate reseller. But nevertheless, this is a trend that we've seen, which is the strength of the SMR channel. And if you look at it overall for the year, you can see that it is the fastest growing channel in 2022, 7.5% compared to 6.1% for the corporate reseller channel. Corporate reseller channel had a particularly strong quarter in Q2 when it grew by about 15%. So this made me look at the channel split in a little bit more detail. I thought this would be interesting for you because I looked at the share of value growth in Q4 2022. And I've put the absolute amounts there as well as the percentage growth. The absolute amounts are really to make you realize we can just forget about retail chain, e-tailer consumer, and e-tailer business for value business. Even if they've got a nice high percentage growth, like 80% in retail, it's 80% on a very small amount. What you can actually see here is 23% growth in value sales in Q4 2022, and only 2% in corporate reseller. And the other extraordinary thing, which it would have been a first, is that small and medium reseller was nearly larger in absolute terms than the corporate reseller channel in the value business. So that's pretty amazing. And I know there's a huge focus on getting to those SMR resellers and through to the small and medium-sized businesses. When you look at it now, they've grabbed 3% of market share of the market. So they've gone from 43% to 46%, and corporate resellers have gone down to below 50%. What I thought you'd also be interested to see was the percentage growth by industry sector. I've taken the top 10 value sectors. So, for example, corporate reseller grew by -1% in software and licenses, -6% in warranties and services. And you can see the one area of huge growth for corporate resellers in the value sector was wireless networking. When you look at SMR, you can see that in every sector other than wireless networking, it was beating the corporate reseller channel in terms of growth, which is pretty impressive. So I think that's a big takeaway. Now, I did think to myself, I hear anecdotic evidence about stuff going direct to corporate resellers, and the corporate resellers are actually doing well. That's based on not just the hardware that they sell, but all the value-added services. So I thought, let's have a look at our corporate reseller panel. And we have two countries where we have very well-established corporate reseller panels with Computer Center, Softcat, Bachelor, etc., all who give their data to us. So quite interesting to see how the distribution selling to corporate reseller growth rates compared to the corporate reseller growth rates. And so let's have a look at this for the UK and France. So what you can see is that the distribution to corporate reseller in Q4 was -10% in the UK and +6% in France. But when you look at the corporate reseller sales, you can see it's up by 22 and 28%. When you look at the full year, you see 0% growth and 11% in the UK and France. And when you look at it on the corporate reseller panel, you can see 14 and 16% growth. So I think that talking to people, I think what is happening is that some very big deals are probably going direct. I think the majority of business goes through distribution, but some very big deals. And that makes a big difference and may explain why it is that the corporate reseller channel is looking as though it's not doing quite so well. And I think that everybody is keen for us as context to help to highlight these types of trends to help people to understand the total market as opposed to just the distribution market. So I hope that's helpful for you to give you some insight into that. So what growth do you see overall for the channel in 2023? Now, we have not finished our forecasting process. We've just started our forecasting process. And so I'll be very interested to see what people think is the consensus view of growth. So we have quite a few going for flat, 3 to 5, only a few in negative and a few at flat. Okay, well, that's very encouraging, 3 to 5%. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And I've got some more detailed questions. A bit of a micro question, but what do you see overall for the channel in Q1 2023? Have you started to put together your forecasts for the first quarter? Be interesting to see what people are thinking. There's a bit of a negative feeling from some quarters about the first quarter because of the overall macroeconomic conditions. There's a very positive feeling from the value business, which has got huge backlogs, which they expect to go through in the first quarter. So it's a bit of a mixed bag for us in terms of what the first quarter is. The other feedback we're getting clearly is that people feel more overall positive about the second half of the year because of the macroeconomic conditions. But it looks like people are seeing a bit of a flat quarter there. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you about backlog. So it's really important to get a sense of whether the backlog is growing, static, or decreasing. This is such a helpful measure to know because if it is, we know that there's been a huge B2B backlog, and I'm hearing that orders are slowing down, but I think that it wouldn't surprise me at all. It looks like most people are saying that, oh, that's interesting. So it's about 2/3, 1/3. So 2/3 are saying it's decreasing. Okay. And then let's move on. And what about the consumer backlog? Is that growing or is it decreasing? I'm going to end off with a question which has been such a fascinating one that we've discussed over the last year. And this is a word poll. So you can put into it whatever word you think is most going to impact the channel in 2023. When I show you the responses to the last 3 times you've responded, it's almost like the history of 2022 kind of really rolls out. Cash flow is a big one. Everyone is, interest rates is another one, which we know is really impacting things. This looks like a bit of a mixture of the previous quarters. Okay, I think that we've got the idea there. Inflation, recession, macroeconomics, confidence, cash flow, talent, layoffs. I heard one anecdote from a reseller in the forecasting sessions that said that big projects were being put on hold because big companies were laying off people, and so there weren't the staff to do the implementation of new projects, which is quite interesting. I had not heard that before. So this was the history of last year: inflation and supply chain and pandemic, inflation and war, obviously after the Ukrainian war, and then it turned into recession in October, consumer spending, uncertainty. So I think that what we're actually seeing now as we go into 2023, so it seems like it's really sort of coming together with that inflation, recession, macroeconomics is the key thing which you see influencing the year. And there is time if there's anyone who has any questions at all.
Adam, I think there's a question in the chats from Simon.
Okay, so if servers were up 35%, but infrastructure is up 5%, does that mean that storage networking was strong? No, it doesn't. In fact, it means that there's quite a few categories that go into the infrastructure. So some of those were not growing as strongly as servers. So storage was growing at around about 5%. And storage is very large in the numbers. So that brings down the overall growth. But then there's also other categories. Computing components we put into the overall infrastructure number, and computing components were negative. So it's just how we combine things. But definitely storage was not negative in Q4, and networking was strongly positive, particularly the wireless networking was very, very strong. But also even networking switches was very strong as well.
You mentioned one country, I think it was Poland, you mentioned it in reference to with the EU funding.
Yeah.
What are you seeing across the board in Europe relative to that? Is the funding being deployed? Is there confusion? Do people understand what they have and how to spend it, et cetera? What are you seeing?
So I'd say two countries are leading the way, Spain and Italy. They've got projects that they're actually pushing out. Italy has got huge budget of infrastructure renewal. Spain, interestingly, very much focusing on enabling small companies to digitalize. But also I was hearing of some projects that are coming through as well in the forecasting sessions in Spain. But it is not quite as visible as Italy. Italy has been very, very like upfront about it. So those are the two countries that are leading the way. Poland has a huge amount that is allocated to it, but because of the differences on the political front has not been able to bring those revenues through. But I mean, as soon as they come through, because the Polish revenues have been really so much influenced by the public tenders. A lot of the growth in Poland has been through public tenders. We once showed it in one of our webinars, the number of tenders in Poland, and it was about 3 pages of PowerPoint that was just one after the other showing what was going on in Poland.
Okay, well, hey, thank you all, and well, talk to you in 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks.